Live from Austin, Texas, this is the Plutopia News Network. Our guest this time is David Swedlow, who is in transit. The not ready for cable news players are here. Susie Sheeler, Scoop Sweeney, and our designated Illuminatus, John Lebkowski. Hello, Illumino.
Hey.
Hello.
Are you illumined?
So when we start the thing, I usually, hold on. David doesn't have the link.
Oh, no.
He says it's no longer on the, hold on. Let me get him the link.
Well, now the folks can see that we are not perfect. We usually are, but it's first time.
And we're not lip syncing. This is real.
It's
live.
all real, folks. As real as you get in these days and times.
I'm getting a new Mac so that things won't take me so long anymore.
That's a good idea.
Okay, there we go. I gave it to him. Wait.
This is
there
called
it is.
Behind the Scenes.
We are behind the scenes right now with Plutopia.
Bloopers.
You can see us in our underwear if I stand up anyway, which I won't be doing.
Don't do it, man. Don't. Come on.
Yes.
That's the Plutopia challenge.
Welcome. We're all here now.
Is David here?
I see him.
Well, yes, sure.
Welcome,
hey,
David.
Hi.
I'm going to hop out and hop back in. I just got on the wrong, I'm on the wrong account. 1 moment. Be right back.
Okay. The wrong account.
We'll just hum the Jeopardy theme.
Did you see his name at the bottom? It was red circle or circle something.
Oh, yeah.
So he's probably using a different one. Yeah.
One of his many projects or organizations. So, as soon as he comes back, I will introduce him. But meanwhile, all of you people out there who are watching us, the thousands of you, the hordes of people who join us every week, we are coming back after the break. We were off for a couple of weeks, so we're all well rested.
We've been off for years, actually, but that's a different matter.
Well, I mean, different level of off.
Off.
And I'm going to introduce our very special guest, Mr. David Swedlow. Hello, David.
Good evening. Good evening. Good to see you, John.
It's great to see you. And David is, David and I have been friends for a long time, but he is now a leadership and development coach for others who are exploring the collective edge of this moment we are entering. And David's been tracking the liminal space that spans technology and culture for over 25 years. That's 2.5 decades, folks. And he's been noticing most recently trends in collective awareness, wisdom cultivation, training in relational practices such as circling, collective presencing, warm data labs, among others. And one thing I think we're going to talk tonight is sense making. How do we make sense of all the crazy shit that's going on?
It's a good question.
Right on. But first, you should kind of let us know what. I mean, I just rattled off a number of things that you've been working with, circling, collective presencing, etc. What are you most focused on now? What are you up to most recently?
Well, let's see. So, it's easiest to say a bit about my technology background because I've been doing IT work with quality assurance and project management, support, development, managing, working for the state, working for private sector, startup companies, large companies, the whole gamut. But I've always had my eye on what is it that makes this culture tick? Because I was always interested in the places where we kind of ground to a halt when critical decisions needed to be made, when things went awry, what were the things that made things go awry, and what sort of leadership skills and leadership traits made that possible to break through that. So I was always kind of paying attention in the back of my mind to the meta narrative. What's happening that's not really so much visible and seen on the front lines. Because by looking at the front line of it, it looks pretty similar. One company looks pretty much the same as the other. Agile processes versus waterfall processes. Yeah, okay, it's a little bit different, but really there was something more deep embedded in the cultural space that was intangible and yet sensible. Like I could tell there was something distinct about it. So I've always paid attention to that and wondered what could I do to pay attention more closely to that. And John, I think you may know Otto Scharmer and his work with Theory U. Have you heard of that?
I know of him. Yeah.
Yeah, he's at
I'm not
MIT.
real familiar with it.
He and Peter Senge started the Presidencing Institute at MIT a number of years ago, along with Betty Sue Flowers and Joseph Jaworski. They wrote a book called Presidencing many years ago. And they were looking at systems theory, basically. And so there's something like I hadn't been paying attention primarily to systems theory as a foreground study, but I had, as I started to become more aware of it, I was like, oh, this is interesting too. I think that this is talking about the cultural piece that I'm looking at. These things overlap. But I'm also paying attention to things like the development of artificial intelligence. So I'm looking at large-scale patterns as we move through culture. What's going on, and what are the pivotal points that I think may be useful for us to notice. So just to say, up till now, what the thing that's really fascinating is the whole COVID thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, it's tempting to think right now with what happened yesterday in the Capitol and what's going on in the United States that this is unprecedented times. Oh my God, we've never seen anything like this. But you were alive. You remember students getting shot and killed at Kent State, the Vietnam War, protests.
Yeah, I think the thing, well, when they say this was unprecedented, like it's been 2 centuries since anybody's broken into the Capitol like that. So that's it's not unprecedented, but it's kind of unusual. It was really sort of the breach of institution, I think, that seemed so unusual about yesterday, and the fact that it was directed by a sitting president.
Lindsey Graham came out today and said that that essentially the reason that these people did this, thought they could get away with it, is that the people who did this in Portland and in Seattle weren't prosecuted. And so that meant that these people felt like they could do it too. And I disagree with that heartily, because this is the nation's capital. This isn't just some random city. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but it's the nation's capital. It's a whole different thing.
I'm not sure that that anyone who committed violence in any of those earlier protests were not prosecuted. I think the problem is, I mean, they weren't like, if they were breaking into something like shattering a store window or something like that and they got caught, they were almost certainly prosecuted. Mm-hmm. And probably more likely. Plus, the police weren't kind of helping them along and saying, "Oh,
of scale too.
Window." They didn't
large.
I'm sorry, David. We're getting.
Well, no, it's actually a really good point. I'd say that I'm going to say something that's a little bit probably provocative and may not be completely popular, which is I think that I'm disheartened by both parties. I'm disheartened by all aspects of the press. I'm disheartened by a lot of people who demonize any particular view, because what's clear is that there is real pain, there is real hurting on both the right and the left. Not to say that it's justified to act up in that way, but there's something really deep that's happening, and it's an outbreak of a kind of expression of a deep trauma that I think is coming to the surface.
Well, it does make it worse to be dismissive of it on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's really hard to take something like QAnon seriously unless you're part of that movement.
Well, I'll say there's I've been part of the circling practice that I've engaged in has allowed me to do I'll say a little bit about that as just for context. Circling is a relational practice. It's a mindfulness practice that focuses on relational awareness rather than body awareness. It includes body awareness, but it's noticing that the interconnectedness between you and me affects my somatic experience as much as my breathing or how my thoughts are moving. And if I actually bring awareness to that in a way that's conscious and aware, and actually I can become even more aware of a somatic experience of that. So it's something like, they're interesting to notice the way that narrative hijacks my somatic experience and can get me into the notion of thinking, oh my God, you're an evil person because you're doing something that's making me feel agitated. I'm oversimplifying, but the reality is anybody who's married for more than a year, probably less so, can recognize those
or more than a century.
yeah. Can recognize those moments when tiny little things can agitate you to the point of losing your temper beyond reasonableness. So, yeah. It's a funny kind of a thing, and it's like, oh, what's happening to me? I'll out myself on something that I did. This is I'm embarrassed by this, but you've known me for a while, John. And a lot of people who know me would say they can't imagine me getting enraged or being terribly resentful of anything. I can get annoyed, but I was dropping my daughter off at high school a few years ago, and someone decided in the school zone to pass me. So I was going 20 miles per hour and they passed me. And for whatever reason, it triggered an aggressive response in me. And as they passed me, they were going probably 35, 40 miles an hour in order to pass me. I lost my temper and I revved my engine and rammed up very close to them, almost ran into them, and I caught myself. I thought, what am I doing? I've completely lost all rationality in this moment. And it was a shocking thing for me to recognize how I could go so quickly to a point of expressing rage. And it's like, this is something very unusual. So there's something like that in my practice of like, what is happening when my body gets hijacked like that? I mention that because the practice is like noticing, okay, what is that somatically? How do I notice whenever some narrative, some story that I'm at risk or I'm in danger or some value is threatened in a way that requires excessive force? It's like often when I actually pay attention to my body, it's something very tiny and it's something rooted in an incident in the past. So even without necessarily needing to go through therapy, just noticing my body responding that way allowed me to catch it right in the very instances of it. Whenever I feel an instant rush of adrenaline in my body, it's interesting. It's kind of similar to someone who trains themselves to do the lucid dreaming. I don't know if you've ever tried to do lucid dreaming where you look at your hands and you ask yourself, am I dreaming? And you flip the light switch, and then in your dream, when you do that, you can actually notice, oh, you do that dream. Oh, wait a minute, the light level doesn't change when I change the light switch. Oh, my hand looks funny, and you can realize you're dreaming. It's sort of similar. Like I would catch myself if I get into one of those states where I suddenly have an instantaneous evolution or elevation of my cortisol and my adrenaline. I would notice I have lost my curiosity. I am certain of something right now, and I'm no longer actually paying attention to a lot of the details. Everything is narrowed to a very fine window. So that practice for a period of time allowed me to look at this and look at social situations from a little bit of a different perspective. And from that perspective, it's been interesting to watch. We're talking about sense making. It's interesting to watch. I started prior to COVID even, and noticing from a curiosity perspective, what is it with the flat earthers? not need to go into that. Obviously, you're not going to have the argument about it, but the epidemic of people who are interested in flat Earth theories was curious. Like, what's happening for people? Why is this? What's happening that this is something of issue? And then COVID comes along, and it's like, oh, this looks like a progressive degradation of the capacity to rely on the critical functions that our society is based on a common sense of awareness and a common sense of meaning making.
Wait, are you saying the Earth isn't flat?
I'm saying I haven't been out there to see it myself. You know, it's funny because I was joking that at this point, I believe that you could probably take a flat earther up into space and show them, and they say, yeah, very nice VR goggles. I don't know how you did it, but I'm not buying it.
David, you were talking about your burst of anger, and I've experienced that over time. I'm a fairly even-tempered person, but I found that anger or dealing with people in an angry manner is actually contagious. I worked in the music business for a long time and also in information technology as a manager. And I got with other managers who that was their only way of dealing. They were always angry. They were always, expressing their rage at whatever it was that they didn't like. And it was contagious. And I found that if I let that get to infect me, that the end result was always disastrous. Trying to deal with someone with rage and extreme anger, almost every time I fell into that, it was a disaster, and I ended up regretting it. And have you seen anything like that of this kind of angry way of dealing with the world being contagious?
Absolutely. I think that's a really important observation that, and in fact, I'll say one of the things that I noticed early in my life was the degree to which I was affected by advertising. This is one of those things that was really surprising to me as a kid. It was like, wow, I can tell that advertisers are really effective at getting in and messing with my emotional centers to get me to want something. And I thought it was just kind of an interesting thing to notice until when I was in college, living by myself. I succumbed to the addiction. I succumbed to the temptation of buying a subscription to cable TV, and I found myself staying up till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning watching shopping channels. And I thought, I've got a problem. This is a real addiction, and I had to go cold turkey. And so I got rid of my television for the first time in my life and just went cold turkey. Didn't watch any television for 6 months. And after about 6 months, I walked into a friend's house who was watching TV, and I could feel a familiar rush of neurochemicals running through my body. And I thought it was almost like walking around somebody who's smoking again. And I thought it's amazing how much I'm influenced by that. So part of the awareness is not just about anger, but around all emotions. Oh, there's something very tempting to go along with a narrative. And so I started to really pay much more attention to the way that movies and music and things like that, especially documentaries. And it was like, oh, everything has a narrative arc that is attempting to get me to believe something. And I could feel, again, with a more subtle awareness now, the way that they were shifting my sensibilities about where the line was. I thought they're really getting good about subtle ways. I'll name one thing. I watched a documentary, What the Health. What the Health was a documentary about the meat industry and specifically about the medical associations that are supposed to be looking out for our health, but they were sponsored by the processed food industry. And it's like, wait a minute, you know that the processed foods that you're advertising, that you're saying these are the foods that you want to do, are responsible for this. Now I'm watching the movie with an awareness that, okay, this is propaganda-ish, right? This is definitely a narrative that's told from a specific angle. but I'm actually interested in giving up my, I want to stop eating so much meat. And by the end of the movie, I felt like I'm not a meat eater. And so for 6 months, I didn't eat meat at all. I was pleased with that. I kind of allowed myself to be tuned to that message, but it was amazing how effective it was. It was not painful. I had tried previously to take on a vegetarian diet and was unable to, but watching this documentary, somehow I was like, huh, that's interesting. I've allowed myself to be neuro-linguistically programmed, I would say, in a way that was very effective and beneficial from my perspective. But then I watched another movie in which it was doing the same thing, and I found the flip where it's like, nope, I'm not willing to do that. And so I was becoming very aware of not just anger, but other ways. I'll say that how this relates to the current situation. I have many liberal friends. I'm liberal myself, and yet when I watched Trump being elected, after Trump's election, when I watched my friends argue about, oh my God, he's evil, I was aware, everything that he's doing is intended to engender the reaction that you're having. The outrage that you feel, that's planned. That is absolutely the desired impact on liberals. And it was sort of an odd thing because it was like, yeah, but I'm not going to give him the satisfaction of not responding that way.
So you think he's trolling?
Yeah, he's absolutely trolling.
Yeah.
I don't even know that he's consciously trolling. It's hard for me to know if he's smart enough to be consciously trolling to that extent. But, well, it's funny because I would say he's for sure a very classic narcissist, right?
Yeah.
I think he's actively trolling because he knows the people he desires to be in his group will respond positively to the insults and the taunts and the trolling he did with just about any kind of liberal or progressive cause.
I don't know. Maybe it's semantics, but I don't think that's trolling. I think he's just being an asshole. He's being himself. And if it were anyone else, that would be trolling, but he's just being himself. He's not trying to necessarily, I mean, in my opinion, I don't think he's smart enough to do that. I think he's just being him, and he's a dick.
Well, it's interesting. I'd say he has a very fine-tuned awareness of the impact that he has on his audience, and he knows how to. He actually, it's a kind of emotional intelligence that narcissists don't have. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not any kind of professional that knows anything about this in any depth. But what I can see is that when I stepped back and watched him, the line that he walked up to, and it was an artful way that he spoke to one audience and drew them out and spoke to another audience in order to inflame them. And it was like a very fine-grained attunement to exactly where that line was. He could feel it in his body and the response of the people that he was speaking to. So it's not intelligence in the same kind of cognitive stuff. It's not an Einstein, but it is this knowingness about where people's social boundaries are.
That makes sense. I mean, I can tell he feeds off it. You can see him feeding off of it.
Well, that's the thing. I think that he has this kind of, well, go ahead, Susie. And then
No. That's what I wanted to say. Go ahead.
Well, I just think he has this kind of, I think it's sensual for him. I think he has a visceral approach to it where it makes him feel something to pull people's switches, right? And when he sees he's having an effect on people, he has some kind of like dopamine rush from it. And that over the years, he's tried to become a salesman and a supposed deal maker and all that. And he never was that great at it. But what he was good at, not so much as being persuasive, but as having an effect on people. And rather than try to persuade people per se, he just looks for that effect. He just tries to have that effect because it gives him a rush. I don't think he is goal driven so much or is doing it for a particular purpose other than just the way it makes him feel.
I think a lot of his approach is a result of some of his mentors like Roy Cohn and his father, were very manipulative people, and the people he's worked with over the many years, because he's picked up a lot of evil skills, if you will.
It's interesting. We've gone pretty far in this without bringing up Hitler, but here I'm going to bring up Hitler. Just
Godwin's law rears its ugly head.
But the reason is just because, and there I've disturbed Skip.
If the shoe fits, though,
Well, the thing that was very, the point that I'd bring up is that in the discussion about whether or not, and this is one of those questions of, if I were in Nazi Germany, how would I behave? Would I have stood up to Hitler? And it was one of the things that, if I'm honest with myself, the truth is I don't know. I would like to think so, but honestly, I can't tell. And I think it's that honesty that actually gives me some hope that I might. If I had the courage, I think I would say, wow, this is really problematic. But the reality is, Hitler himself was also just a master manipulator. He really conveyed a story and a narrative in a way that pulled a lot of people along, and learned how to ride that wave in such a way that it instilled in people a passionate response that was advantageous to what he wanted to do. And Trump is very similar. And a lot of the people, are the reason I bring it up, and the reason I bring this to our mind is there are a couple of cognitive scientists that I follow. One of them is a guy named Donald Hoffman, and Donald Hoffman wrote a book called The Case Against Reality. The Case Against Reality.
I know of that book. Yeah,
it's a very interesting book, and one of the models that one of the things that he mentions is, in Australia there's a kind of a beetle, the jewel beetle, that evolutionarily is attracted to a particular pattern on the female as the good mating signal. Well, it just so happened that beer bottles had a facsimile of that pattern, and the beetles would assume that the beer bottles were females and try to mate with the beer bottles, to the extent that it was actually threatening their survival. They preferred the beer bottles over the actual females. That's a big, fat, juicy mating partner right there, and I am not going to go for the actual female. She is not as attractive as that beer bottle. They actually had to outlaw those the manufacturer of those beer bottles. They had to change the design because it was so disadvantageous to these beetles. Now, it's interesting for us to look at it and say, stupid beetle, how can you fall for such a simple pattern? Until you back up and look at human beings. And one of the things that Donald Hoffman has claimed, and it's an interesting claim, is that our predilection for the notion of rationality as giving us a good indicator of truth is akin to the attraction that the beer bottle has as a good indication of a mating partner. Rationality doesn't give you the truth. It gives you the filter that brings it within a range of believability. If I can create a pattern of narrative that will cross your smell test, that smells like the truth, that's good enough.
Yeah, we sort of overrate our brains. We think there's more going on there than there really is. I mean, I was just reading this recently, and I can't remember where it was, but the brains were not really created specifically for thinking. They were created to support our survival, however that works, right? So this idea that we have, that we can have these amazing brains and that we remember all kinds of things. Our memories are probably not as good as we think they are. Almost, I mean, in some cases, people have remarkable memories, but it's very unusual. Most people can't remember all that much, but they think they remember more than they do. And some of their memories, this is something I've learned over the years. When you get older, you really become aware of this. Not only do I not remember a lot of things that, I might think I remember it until I really think about it, but also I remember things that never happened, and I have found evidence of that. One example is seeing a movie where you absolutely remember something happening in the movie, and then many years later you watch the movie again and that thing you thought happened in the movie didn't. You know, one example is when Philip Seymour Hoffman was in one of the Mission Impossible episodes as the villain. He met his end, before the movie was over. My memory of how that happened was entirely different from how it happened when I watched it again years later. So I know that people used to tell me what a great memory I had because I remember the names of like actors in old TV shows and that sort of thing. But really, I don't have a remarkable memory, and I don't really know anybody who does, but I do know people who think they do.
It's a good point, and I think it's right along those lines. I similarly had examples like that. I remember movies for the archetypal narrative that's something, I will think of an example, and they're good for metaphors. I love movies as metaphors. The Matrix is obviously a good one. I also I'll take this opportunity for anybody who's listening. If you're either too young or too old to have watched Inside Out because you didn't have children at the right age, I recommend you go watch the movie Inside Out. Inside Out is an incredibly powerful movie in terms of the cartoon version of the way the brain works is overly cartoonized. It's not, it's a very simplified version of the brain, but it actually does show an essential aspect of what happens in the brain of an adolescent going through adolescent changes. All of a sudden, the things that are crucial for life to work well change. There are hormonal changes and growth changes, and I'm no longer interested in the silly games. I'm interested in sexuality, and it's a whole new paradigm. The movie happens to take place at the same time this young woman going through puberty is also, her parents are moving, so there are different stresses. But it's interesting to notice the way that the patterns that make sense of the world no longer make sense of the world, and the coping mechanism for how to deal with that. Not only is it interesting to kind of watch the way that flips over, but it's also interesting to notice the way that we can become aware that our emotions and our inner workings, which have felt adversarial, actually can work together in a very powerful way. And that we each experience that in going through those shifts. Terrible twos and adolescence are two very, very powerful shifts. I would propose that there's also adult shifts and development that we don't see as readily.
Absolutely.
And in a way, I think that the reason we don't see it is because our culture has kind of locked us into a sort of a adolescent mindset, more or less. Western civilized people tend to act more in terms of an impulsive way of thinking that is more akin to what teenagers think than an actual fully developed adult who can use their prefrontal cortex very effectively, and increasingly so. And I think there are reasons for that, but that's one of the things that I'm paying attention to, circling in other practices that deal with relational practices, these awarenesses that, it seems like we are kind of stuck in a loop. We're stuck in a loop of development that is increasing attention that I think will eventually, and I think is now currently in the process of tipping over. We're in a tipping point of, I think, a shift in adult development.
Yeah, I mean, this brings me to the idea of insight, and as someone who studies Buddhism, I'm very aware of the importance of insights to the evolution of that kind of understanding of the world. One of the things that Buddhism does, and the various mechanisms it has, like koans or meditation or ongoing Dharma talks, it's all about sort of cultivating, pushing yourself to the point where you have an insight and where your understanding of the world changes. And people talk about satori, about there being enlightenment in Buddhism. Well, it's not something that just happens once. it's an ongoing thing. You have insight after insight as you practice over the years, because what you're really doing is you're focusing on uh, your place in the world, and you're focusing, you're trying to comprehend the Dharma. And um, there's just boost after boost after boost. And sometimes you'll have an insight and you'll sort of forget the insight or whatever. But as you go along, you're sort of evolving, and you're maturing in a way. And I don't think that ever has to stop. It does stop for some people. Some people just stop developing. But I think that it's possible to continue developing throughout your life. And I suppose the thing that you're moving toward is what we call wisdom, an evolution of wisdom. And this relates to the other things we're talking about. Like, one thing is the realization that your mind is not maybe as expansive or as powerful as you thought it was. I think is an important insight to have. The understanding that your perception of reality is very limited, really, and it's very focused on what you sort of need. It's sort of based on what you need to know. The world presents itself to you on a need to know basis. And as you start to understand these things, you realize that there's so much that you don't know. There's a real humility that comes with it. And there's also an impact on how you make sense of the world. And your sense making itself kind of evolves, and you find yourself at points where the way that you're making sense of the world will really shift based on some insight that you've had.
It's very fascinating. I'd say that notion, so something like the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's a metaphor that I've thought about. And this, if we look at it and saying, oh, this is the straw. Everybody, this is the evil straw. None of the other straws broke the camel's back, but this one I put it on and it broke it. So we should outlaw this straw. It's like, it's a very oversimplified notion, but there's something of truth to that. Like, there's something like, I think that life tends to complexify to the point of growing us to the need to get it to a tipping point of maturing to another layer, and that we can sort of intensify that focus. So Buddhists and others who had an odd upbringing. Buddha is an interesting story in that he was shielded from suffering until he got to adulthood, beyond the point that a normal person encounters suffering, according to the mythology. But students of Buddha, or people who do Zen practice or meditative practice, will sit in a cave for many years, or sit will prolong the practice of attaining insight. In a way, sort of ripening their brain. They're putting themselves in an accelerated stress mode that brings a level of development in their brain that allows them to have that tipping point early. And it's an evidence of, kind of a ripening of fruit. It's sort of putting a tree in a hothouse and growing the fruit more quickly. Life will do that over time eventually, but you can speed up the process if you know what the conditions are that lead to that ripening. I just happen to think that we're very close now to one of those tipping points where the stress level that we're all engaged in is reaching a collective tipping point, so that people like, name some of the people like Byron Katie, or some of the other people who had spontaneous awakening experiences, just did so from life. Life was stressful enough for them that it was pushing them to that tipping point level, even though they weren't doing it in a way that most Zen or Buddhist practitioners would.
Yeah, but those a good Zen master stresses his students out for sure,
Right.
And that stress is productive stress.
Right. And so I think that we're at a point now where that tipping point is, we're at a point where I think it's going to, more people will tip over into a kind of a collective awareness. And I want to name a pattern that I see. We talked about rationality. There's another cognitive scientist that I really like a lot. His name is John Vervaeke, Vervaeke. Really interesting guy. And he has a YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It's a 50 lecture series, 51-hour lectures, and they're really good. It's a little bit heavy. It's basically a college course, but they're freely available on YouTube, and highly recommended for anyone who has an interest in this. And one of the points that there's actually a shorter video called "What is Wisdom" that John Vervaeke has. That's a good highlight of what his notion is. But the highlight notion is intelligence is the mind's ability to recognize patterns. And the patterns that you recognize may be valid patterns or invalid patterns. We recognize, like, I close the refrigerator and the light on the garage comes on. Oh, well, that's connected. And oh, wait, no, it's not connected. But I can fool myself into thinking that the pattern is connected. Rationality is a feedback loop that allows me to narrow the reasonableness of those patterns. No, that's a bias. That's actually a superficial connection that's not actually indicative of a real connection between those things. So rationality allows me to filter that down to a more narrow view. But once I get to a narrow view, I may be filtering out more of actual valid data. I'm getting false negatives on everything that I consider is right within its range. How do I know what to include that I'm no longer paying any attention to, because I have my lens focused so narrowly? And what John Vervaeke says is that's a feedback loop on rationality that allows us to open and narrow and be able to kind of continually change that lens and open it up again and narrow it back down again, and notice that pattern. We have a strong tendency, once we get a map that works, to keep it. Evolutionarily, like we were talking about with the jewel beetle, that makes sense. But if circumstances are changing rapidly, your maps must also change rapidly. So this ability of, oh, the map that we had, that money is good and we should get jobs and just pump the effluent out into the ocean. It's like, okay, we've changed the environment now in such a way that that pattern no longer works. And we collectively need to respond with a new pattern. But in the liminal space, in that space between the change, it is a kind of a weird polar flip, and the polar flip of good and bad, what we consider to be a good pattern and a bad pattern, flips in a way where the valence is no longer really clear to tell. And I believe we're in one of those moments right now. So that wisdom cultivation, that ability to pay attention not only to my rational experience, but also how do I break frame on that? How do I widen my window without letting in all of the irrelevant stuff that I filtered out previously? How can I do that effectively? Is a real interesting challenge, and it's something that I think we're just on the cusp of right now.
You spoke about people at a tipping point and it being a positive evolution. I've experienced people reaching a tipping point that went the other way. How can people deal with the negative tipping points? Because I've seen some people that were well-centered and something happened. They got that last stressing event and they went downhill. They went off the deep end.
It's a really good point. I think it's especially salient today, right? I was just reading about, I don't keep up with the news very, very well, but some public life, someone in the public eye, two politicians whose son committed suicide on New Year's Eve, right? Good kid, hard worker, high values, but just suffer from depression. Those patterns that we can engage in. You know, it's interesting. I'll go back to John Vervaeke. One of the things that's very fascinating to me about John Vervaeke is that he, and this is something that he shares, and he talks about this, grew up in a very conservative Christian cult, a very aggressive, punishing mentality. And so he grew up with a very critical view, a self-view that was of a punishing deity that really was going to keep him in line. as a teen, he realized this is not good, and left that. And that's what inclined him to pursue practices like Tai Chi and meditation and rationality and philosophy. He still to this day recognizes the allure of the reward mechanism and the brutality of the punishing mechanism, even as an adult. It's in a way that someone who may have smoked cigarettes for the years and had given them up never quite completely loses the temptation, that urge that's there. That urge is deeply embedded. And so he is still aware of that, even though he has learned a lot of practices to do that. And somebody asked him, he said, how do you deal with the feeling of self-criticism, of disappointment? And he said, it's an ongoing battle. So there are, I think it's an important piece to bring up. I don't know that we ever get completely to a point of being out of the woods. I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's a kind of how much attention and what kind of attention do I give to that, and noticing, am I engaging in my practices in a way that is that I'm not fooling myself? How do I make sure I'm not fooling myself? I think it's one of the reasons that Thich Nhat Hanh said the next Buddha is a Sangha. I think it's important that we find communities of practice that will be honest with ourselves. And it's one of the things that concerns me about the current state of the world right now, where right and left parties, the political parties, are not interested in telling the truth as much as they're interested in getting a specific narrative across. And that concerns me. So I would say we're in a delusional state right now, thinking that to a large extent, across the board.
You spoke about the influence of a cult and the negative influence. And we're seeing the negative influence of a particular cult. The QAnon cult was at the forefront of yesterday's events in the nation's capital. And I'm just wondering, how does one deal with people that they see being sucked into a cult like that? Is there a way to rescue a person like that?
It's a really good question. I don't know if y'all are aware, there's a documentary series on HBO called The Vow, about a cult called NXIVM. It was a personal growth, multi-level marketing cult that looked like, a cross between Amway and Landmark Education, doing something like that. They had earned belts and level up, and actually had, using neuro-linguistic programming, actually had effective programs for doing a lot of stuff. But they also had a bit of a dark underbelly, that the leader of the cult, a guy named Keith Raniere, was able to, similar to Trump or any other effective narcissist, know people's boundaries better than the people know them themselves, and can play with that, can give you a sense of, you can't trust yourself, you trust me with your sense of self more than you trust yourself. And once that change has been made, it is incredibly difficult to break. And the documentary series highlights that in such a way that it really had me, I watched it and was pretty depressed for a little while, because I could see the effectiveness of it. It was shocking. And it's one of those things that's challenging is intelligent people are not immune. In fact, sometimes they're more susceptible.
All of this, controversy with QAnon and similar cults motivated me to go online and order the Illuminatus trilogy, Robert Anton Wilson's marvelous early, that was like 1975, I guess. And there were many cults, blooming in that area. I was living in Berkeley at the time, and we had discussion groups about the whole Discordian society, and all of this seems to be coming true here with things like QAnon and the cult of Trump. And it's just amazing how Wilson kind of predicted what was coming.
Well, and I think that we can recognize the patterns in these liminal states. There is a likelihood that cults will proliferate. People need to have a feeling of meaning in their lives, and the moment when we actually go through a crisis. I'll mention something else that's interesting with John Vervaeke and his meaning crisis. He starts back at 70,000 years ago as a pivotal moment when human population reduced down to 10,000 people, but more prominently during the Axial Age with the collapse of the Bronze Age collapse, and also the growth of Greek and Indian philosophy. There were a lot of things that came about, Buddha and all of that came about at the same time, roughly. Also, a lot of really powerful things come around at the time of plagues. Plagues are often pivotal moments where we shift from one mindset to another mindset. I would claim that the plague is not the causative effect. It, like I was talking about before, is the straw that broke the camel's back. It's the stress point that created enough of a tipping point where human beings that were ready and ripe to fall over, it was just a little bit of the tremor that created sort of a tectonic shift and allowed humanity to make a more rapid change. But during that period when it's ripe for that, I think cults are attempts at resolving the tension of the meaning crisis. So I'm not surprised that cults arise. I think it's indicative when a lot of cults arise that, oh, we're seeing a meta pattern of something that's underway, something that's trying to emerge.
We've been trying to start a cult.
Is it working?
We haven't been that successful yet. We're going to have to really up our game quite a bit. No, actually, I mean, there were faux cults. There were, I mean, think of the Church of the Subgenius, things that were sort of like poking fun at cult ideas. And I was part of a thing called fringeware back, very early as the internet was just starting to emerge as in the direction of mainstreaming. And, we were focused on all kinds of cult stuff, but very tongue-in-cheek about it, very ironic about it. And I was always a little surprised when I stumbled into somebody who really seemed to take those things seriously, I mean, even back then, I don't think even Alex Jones believed his own bullshit. He was just kind of playing with this idea of this InfoWars idea that he had. Back then, he was on Access Television here in Austin, and that was the only way that you could see him. So he didn't.
Too, I think.
Remember when we had public access television here?
That's
Wasn't that
it. Yeah.
fun? Isn't that
Well,
great?
that's where Alex Jones came from.
I know, but
do you remember Waking Life, the Rick Linklater movie?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And Alex Jones is in that doing his rant, and it's a fun moment in the movie, right? You're cheering him on. He's railing against the man, and it's like
he's in Scanner Darkly too.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, he's the crazy man on the corner, and this truck pulls up, and they throw him in the back. It's awesome.
Damn, why didn't they leave him there?
No.
It seems that cults get popular or the increase in creation during times of great upheaval and stress and economic upheaval. That seems to always create a cult of some sort. And the time we're in now seems to be rich compost for creating a cult.
And again, I want to be mindful of the potential cause and effect relationship there. I think that it actually is a ripeness in the environment that is leading to both. These things are co-arising. The tension and the movement towards something else that's changing in the pattern gives rise to this, the little tendrils that are the runners that are trying to, and culture that are trying to find a new stable pattern, I think is probably more what's happening.
We've been so focused on Trump for 4 years. It's really going to be kind of interesting to see what happens now as Biden becomes president and whether Trump will just fade. It could be without attention focused on him.
Oh,
You
he's going to have so much attention focused on him. He is going to go to rallies. He is going to be, he's the Messiah. That he's got his own TV network.
I'm not sure it's actually going to happen. I mean,
well, if he goes to prison, it won't. But
because you've seen these things happen. I mean, hula hoops. Who has a hula hoop now?
And
I
it's
mean,
not
maybe
just
Trump
him,
was just a
though.
fad.
Well, I'm willing to join.
Hula Hoop's daughter is going to run senator in Florida.
Yeah. I'm going to join the Trump of the cult of Biden. Get me a nice, well-tailored suit and a snazzy tie and talk.
Nice. I like that.
I'm curious. Did y'all pay any attention to the Unity 2020 movement that Brett Weinstein tried to put together? The alternative third party. I know it was a very tiny little thing, but there was something very interesting about it, which was bring together a candidate from the left and a candidate from the right, mid left, mid right, have them co-lead at the flip of a coin. They had to come to agreement. It was an interesting idea to try to break the taboo against third parties. It didn't take off enough, and I would say there's something like it was also trying to create a little bit of a cult-like leading in that would cause it to tip over. But I am concerned because there are problems with Biden. All right, it's not quite enough just to say not Trump. There are some real concerns about. We have a complex world. Is Biden the guy really to lead us through the most complex challenges that we have in front of us?
Well, sure, because he knows how to delegate. That's an important way to deal with complexity, is to be able to delegate and to be able to get people organized to do things. You don't necessarily have to handle all the complexity yourself. I want to mention that I tried to start a political party, an open source political party, with Are You Serious and Chris Novoselic, who was the bass player for Nirvana at one time. He's kind of into politics now. And it didn't work. It turns out to be really hard. And the funny thing is that we got everybody organized and then it just stopped.
Yeah.
So I think
I think you're right. I think it is really difficult to do. One of the things I'll say just before we end that I think is interesting is that a concern that I had leading up to inauguration is that the Republicans would do exactly what the Democrats did to Trump, is is like they were going to just that we're going to have 4 years of trying to impeach and trying to get him out and trying to disqualify Biden. I think that the way that this has gone out makes that a lot less likely. I think that it's not completely unlikely, and certainly the Republicans are in a minority now, but so the Democrats were during the Trump administration. So I think that there's still a possibility that will be the case, but I think we kind of got a bad taste of it. I think that we sort of tasted the poison of, wait a minute, this kind of demagoguery is really unhealthy.
Well, I mean, I think there's another point about that, which is that Biden is kind of one of those guys. He was in the Senate for years. He's got relationships with a lot of those people. He knows how to work with them. One of the problems with the Obama administration was Obama was never that great at that. And in fact, he was a little bit dismissive of Biden, who, was kind of trying to get him to work better with the legislature. So it's very possible that the Biden thing will be way different than people might think, and certainly way different from the Trump years or the Obama years. That said, I can't think of any president who I would look at and say, oh, that guy really did a great job. I mean, when I was born, it was it was probably Truman the day I was born, and then Eisenhower, and all these presidents after that. I don't think any of those guys was particularly great at being president. So I don't know. I mean, it could be that we just can't depend on presidents to be the panacea for our problems.
I think that's exactly right.
I like the far left and the far right guy being put together. At very least, it'd be like a World Wrestling Federation cage match.
We have reached the end of our time, the end of our cage match. But This was really fascinating, David, and I hope you'll come back and continue this, because there was so much that we could have talked about that we couldn't get to.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you guys for having me
David.
on.
Great. Well, thanks for coming.
Good night.
And off we go again.